Good day, senior high icons. Welcome to ICI AP My E-Class. I'm Mr. Aldrin G. Sikitin, a faculty of Immaculate Conception Polytechnic Senior High School under the General Academic Strand. This semester, I will be handling English 400 or 21st century literature from the Philippines and the world.
Ano lesson? Okay, so today we will be talking about a new lesson, which is literary approaches. When we say literary approaches, these are theories, techniques that you may use when interpreting a certain literary piece. In literature, there are so many literary approaches that you may use, but I will present to you 8 of those literary approaches. So these approaches are commonly used in literature. The first one is formalism. Formalism operates on the idea that any literary text is autonomous, meaning the text can stand alone. Even without the help of any other external factors, you may analyze and interpret a specific text. Formalism rejects the perceived connection between the text and the authors. So, meaning we're going to leave out the authorial factors of to the text. So, meaning the experiences or the life of the author has nothing to do with the text or the meaning of the text. Formalism is a quite broad approach or theory. It has several schools or sub-theories. Two of the most common sub-theories of formalism are the Russian formalism and the no criticism. But before that, let me add this information about formalism. So formalism analyzes the inherent features of a text, meaning it focuses not only on the grammar and the syntax, but also on the literary devices used in the text, like meter and different figures of speech. Also, it reduces the importance of the text's historical, biographical, and cultural context, meaning whenever or wherever the text is written, it has nothing to do with the text. Okay, so you will just focus on the content. You may also try to look at the structure of a specific text. So that's how formalism works. So let's define and characterize the two sub-theories or schools under formalism. Let's start with the Russian formalism. Russian formalism was popularized by several theories or people. One of those is Viktor Shklovsky. Viktor Shklovsky introduced the concept of defamiliarization. When we say defamiliarization, it means that a good literature, through the competent use of language, renews our perception of already familiar things. So, under defamiliarization, you will analyze a familiar concept, a familiar thing, but these things or concepts were described or introduced in a very different way. So in short, making familiar things unfamiliar to your audience. So let us have this example. So this poem was written by a Filipino poet or writer. Let me read it to you. And then while I'm reading, try to guess the title of the poem, because I will present the title at the end of the poem. So while I'm reading it, You may also read and analyze the poem and try to guess its title. Okay? Let me read it to you. Kurutin mo ang tulis na dulo at hubaran ang paglibot nito. Pero wag mong balatan ng tuwiran, yung tama lang para mayroon kang makagat. Lasapin mo ang lahat ng nakalantad na laman. Piho, may aagos na katas. Agapan mo kasi baka tumulo sa kamay mo. Ang pinakamahusay nga'y dilaan mo na ito. Sumigi ka lang, kahit na puro katas ang nguso mo't baba. Masarap naman. Dahan-dahan ang natitira't kagatin mula sa taas, mula sa tagiliran sa pagkatas nito. Kahit napahalikat pasipsip na, hindi maiiwasang may tutulo sa mga daliri mo. Pero huwag mong bitawan, huwag mong pakadiinan, kasi hindi masarap ang lamog o ang nalapirot na. Ipitin mo sa mga labi ang basang buhok, sipsipin mong pahagod hanggang maubos ang katas. Tapos, hubaran mo na ng tuluyan, baliktarin mo at kagatin mula sa ilalim. Banayad, hanggang sa may malambot sa dila, himurin mo hanggang dulo. Okay, so have you guessed the title of the poem? Okay, so in this poem, the writer is describing a concept which is very familiar to us. So, this is the title of the poem. The poem was entitled Ang Pagkain ng Hinog na Mangga. I know that this concept or this thing is very common, but the way how Mr. Edilberto Alegre described or wrote the manner of eating a mango is quite different on the way how we used to eat a mango. So that's how defamiliarization or Russian formalism works. Okay, so next let us have another approach which is new criticism. New criticism is somehow a new name for formalism, since formalism is not that approach which is typically used nowadays. So formalism, new criticism is also known as close reading. So it is a textual reading that leaves out authorial and other external influences. So again, if you will go back to the meaning of formalism, it's the same. Focus on the text, focus on the structure of the text, focus on the things that the writer used in the text itself. His life, his background, and any other factors has nothing to do with or have nothing to do with the text itself. No criticism treats a text whether if it is a self-contained, self-referential object. So meaning, you may analyze the text using its part, okay, using the words in it, using the symbols inside or within the text. It concentrates on the relationships within the text that give it its own distinctive character or form. So for example, we're going to analyze a certain poem, and then you have observed that this poem has only 3 lines or 3 stanzas. 2 of those stanzas contain 5 syllables, and then the other stanza which sits on the middle of the 2 5-syllable stanzas contains 7 syllables. So since this characteristic and features belong to a certain type of poem which is haiku, we may now identify those or that kind of poetry. So that is an example of new criticism. So again, you may also look at the other literary devices used in the text in order to analyze and interpret a specific text under new criticism. Okay, next. So Since no criticism or formalism is quite hard to use when interpreting a specific text, we may commit mistakes or several mistakes. Two of the most commonly committed mistakes are the following. Oh, by the way, it is called fallacy. So the first one is intentional fallacy. Intentional fallacy is a mistake of reading a text based on the author's intended meaning. So in short, we assume things based on what we have read or based on the life of the author. We assume that this specific message is what the author wants to say. So under formalism or under new criticism, it is wrong or it is incorrect. Okay, so you will just focus on the text. Don't ever consider the intended meaning or any other factors when interpreting a specific text. And then the second one is affective fallacy. So, affective fallacy is a mistake of reading a text through readers' emotions. So, kung halimbawa po, doon sa intentional fallacy, nag-assume tayo. Pagdating po kay affective fallacy, nadala naman. Okay? Nadala tayo ng emotion. So, since, for example, the text is quite immensely sad, or what do you call this? The character experiences several problems or conflicts, and you somehow sympathize and empathize with him. So basically, there's a tendency that you will analyze or interpret a specific text based on the built emotion inside you, and that is incorrect or wrong under no criticism, since emotions or feelings are external factors that might affect the interpretation of the text. So we will never ever include or consider our feelings towards the text. Okay, so you will just focus on the content of the text. That's how new criticism and formalism works. Okay, so the third or the fourth one or fourth approach is Marxism. Marxism is derived from the name of Karl Marx. He is a German philosopher and scholar who theorized about society and history. So, from the description of Marx, you will see and already identify that Marxism focuses on society or the societal issues faced by the characters or by the persona of our text. This approach involves how the elements of the social class struggle, primarily the differences between the bourgeois and the proletariat. Marxism focuses on the economic structure as this is the main driving force behind all social condition and historical changes. It believes that a work of literature is a product of a society. Also, you will encounter under Marxism the term materialism. So, how does society uses its people? Okay, so if we're going to apply Marxism in a specific text, we may analyze the works of our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, specifically his two major and most commonly known novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. So, on those novels, we can see and observe how society works or how the social classes works. So, for example, on the Vapor Tabo, you will observe that there's a discrimination between or among social classes, because in Vapor Tabo we have the what we call the upper deck and the lower deck. The upper deck um, houses the mestizos and the pure Spaniards, wherein the lower deck houses it, Indios, or those who are under the what we call lower class and the working class of the society. So in Marxism, you will try to look at those struggles faced by the different social classes, how the upper class treats the lower class and vice versa. So that's how Marxism works. Look at the social struggle or class, the struggle of the social classes, and then try to analyze the text based on those struggles. And then next, we have structuralism. From the word structure, this is quite bloody. This approach or theory emerged in 1950s up to 1960s. It is based on the linguistic theory of Ferdinand de Saussure. It considers language as a system of signs and symbols. So, structuralism is an approach that relates the text to a larger, wider structure through intertextual connections and repetitive patterns. So, in this type of approach, we're going to look at the plot, or how does the plot was structured. It examines the characterization or plot. In order to analyze a text under structuralism, you need to identify the series of signs or events and how those signs affect the conclusion of a specific text. If we're going to somehow use structuralism in the grammatical form of a specific text, you will need to dissect the parts of a certain paragraph, the parts of a certain sentence, the parts of a certain phrase or clause, and then try to analyze how those words affect the meaning of the text. That is the harder part of structuralism. There's one technique under structuralism that we may use to analyze a specific text, which is identifying the binary operations of the text. When we say binary operations, these are the two prevailing characters or two prevailing positions or oppositions in the text. So for example, binary operations or oppositions in a certain text, we have the good side versus the bad side, or the good versus the evil. And then based on that operation or opposition, who do you think will prevail at the end of the story or at the end of the text? Another example is the upper class versus the lower class. Based on that operation or opposition, who do you think will win the fight? Given the fact that the upper class has so much resources to use in order to fight or win the battle. So that is an example of structuralism, wherein you will just reveal the binary operations of the text. So you will just identify what are the two sides of the story. You will just identify who's part of this side and who's part of this side, and who do you think will prevail after or at the end of the text. And then the next one is the post-structuralism or deconstructionism. The term deconstructionism was coined by French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Under deconstructionism, This approach or this theory rejects the binary opposition of structuralism, meaning, how do you say this? Um, in deconstructionism, hindi laging yung mabuti ang mananalo. Let's give chance to the other side to redeem themselves. Hindi laging yung mayaman ang nagwawagi sa bandang huli. So, sa deconstructionism, binibigyan natin ng bagong point of view, yung tinatawag nating binary oppositions. Kasi, sa binary opposition, meron tayong privileged and unprivileged ones. Ayan. So, syempre, since si privileged na sa kanya na lahat, automatically, yung concept natin ay siya yung laging mananalo. But in deconstructionism, binibigyan natin ng power yung kabilang side, yung less privileged side natin. So, binibigyan natin sila ng pagkakataon to redeem themselves. Yun yung ginagawa kay deconstructionism. Parang binibigyan natin ng panibagong point of view yung isang story using the views of the different characters. So, since nire-reject niya nga yung binary opposition ng structuralism, under deconstructionism or post-structuralism, meaning is indefinite and undecidable. So, meanings are unstable, it is changing, and contextual. So, yung meaning ng isang bagay ay nakadepende dun sa magbibigay ng kahulugan. Ganun yung nangyayari kay deconstructionism. So, deconstructionism or post-structuralism is a reader-centered theory. So, meaning dito po, walang maling sagot. Kung itong way na to, yung pagkakaintindi mo sa text, tama. Kasi you have your own basis. You have your own basis or considerations. So, dito, kung ano man yung perception ng isang reader or audience dun sa text, tama yun. Kasi yun yung kanyang pagkakaintindi based dun sa mga nakita niyang evidences and basis doon sa text na kanyang binasa. So, ganun po yung concept ni post-structuralism and deconstructionism. So, deconstructionism, tama. Mamaya, dun sa activity na gagawin nyo, you will encounter deconstructionism there. Okay? So, for example, dun sa text, hindi laging yung privilege yung may kapangyarihan. Okay? Bibigyan ng kapangyarihan yung less privileged ones in order for them to express themselves. Ganun yung mangyayari kay text later on. So, bago ko ma-discuss yung buong text, move na tayo dun sa susunod na approach. So, the next approach is New Historicism. New Historicism emerged in 1980s, early 1980s. In this approach, history is nothing but a narrative text that is contaminated by people's personal biases, assumptions, and many more, under the influence of the culture in which this history belongs. So, New Historicism believes that literature should be studied and interpreted within the context of both the history of the author and the history of the critics. So, basically, we will consider the time, the place, when, and where the piece was written. Okay, so, for example, yung isang story, yung content niya or yung character natin doon ay yung content natin doon ay powerless woman. So, we will consider the time kung kailan sinulat yung text. baka may effect yung time na yon dun sa pagkakasulat ng text. Kaya yung uh, woman dun sa ating text ay quite oppressed or controlled. Ganun yung ginagawa natin kay New Historicism. So parang siya yung kabaliktaran ni formalism. Kung kay formalism, aalisin natin yung authorial factors and then yung other factors, outside factors. Kay New Historicism, we need to consider those factors kasi baka meron siyang effect doon sa ating story. So, New Historicism looks at literature in a wider historical context, examining both how the writer's times affected the work and how the work reflects the writer's time. So, vice versa yung pagko-consider natin. Iko-consider natin yung time kung kailan sinulat yung text kasi baka meron siyang effect dun sa work. And then, iko-consider din natin yung work doon sa baka kasi mamaya yung work na yon nire-reflect niya yung naging buhay ng ating author or writer. So, in turn, recognizing that current cultural contexts color that critic's conclusion. So, those considerations may help us analyze the text and interpret the text better. So, one of its proponents is Michel Foucault. So, maraming proponents yung historicism, but most famous proponent of it is Michel Foucault. So, again, kay New Historicism, yung history natin, isa lang siyang text na merong bias. Kasi for example, let's try to consider the history of the Philippines. Ayan. So we all know that Philippines was colonized by Spain, America, or the United States and Japan. If you will write the history of the Philippines on a Filipinos point of view, basically you will make Filipinos patriarch, what else, nationalist. Ayan. So somehow medyo i-redeem mo yung image ng Filipinos. Yun yung ipapataasin mo kasi ikaw yung sumusulat ng history mo. But if the history of the Philippines was written by the Spain, syempre makikita natin yung side ng Spain. Makikita natin halimbawa yung side ng Amerika kung sila yung magsusulat ng history ng Philippines. Ayan. So, yung ganda nung text ay nakadepende dun sa time, sa cultural background, sa historical background kung kailan sinulat yung text, and it has an effect on the text itself. That's how New Historicism works. And then the last approach is the feminism. I know this is very familiar to you since it's emerging these past few years. Feminism is an approach wherein a text was read within a social context. So that context is on the women's perception. So in particular, it analyzes textual representations from the woman's perspective, like stereotyping and objectification of womanhood. So dito po kay feminism, binibigyan na natin ng equal chance yung women in the society. Kasi if we're going to consider the history, women are oppressed in the last few decades or centuries. Ayan. So, kay feminism po, ina-uplift na natin yung image ng women. Hindi na natin sila kinukulong sa box na pag sinabi nating women, nandun yung word na lang. Ito lang yung kaya niyang gawin, na parang kinukulong natin sila sa ganitong characteristics and descriptions. kay feminism, inaalis na natin yung box na yun. Ayan. So, binibigyan na natin, ina-uplift or tinataas na natin yung image ng women sa society. And then yung objectification na yung kababaihan ay gamit lang ng lalaki, ng kalalakihan. So, inaalis na natin yun kay feminism. Ayan. So, voices behind this approach are the following. So, we have Simon de Beauvoir. We have Rosa Luxemburg and Hannah Arendt. In the Philippines, marami po tayong feminist. For example, one of the most famous feminist in the Philippines is Angel Locsin. Nakita nyo naman po kung paano niya binabago yung image ng women sa society, sa Filipino society. Also, we have the late Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago. Yan. So, isa rin po siyang feminist. So, if we're going to apply feminism, ganito po yan. So, under feminist approach, we may question the existence of the word history. And so, kasi po, history is quite gender biased. If we're going to somehow analyze the word history, we may come up with two words, which is he or his and story. Ayan. So, sabi ko nga sa mga estudyante ko before, bakit hindi natin palitan yung word na history? Bakit hindi siya ginawang we story? Kasi pangit ba siyang pakinggan? Or bakit hindi ginawang her story? Bakit may history? Bakit walang her story? Meron din namang part ang kababaihan sa kasaysayan. Ayan. So, pwede natin siyang questionin under feminist approach. Pero pwede rin po natin siyang gamitin sa New Historicism. So, for example, the concept behind the word history is that history itself is a male-dominated concept or thing. Ayan. So, lagi ko sinasabi din sa mga nakaraang kong estudyante, sa Pilipinas, kung pagbibigay or kung hihingan ko kayo ng 10 bayaning babae, within 30 seconds, kaya nyo bang magbigay? So, ganun yung lagi kong tinatanong. Kasi po, history, totoo naman po, it's a gender-biased word. Kaya po, sabi ko nga, bakit hindi natin gamitin yung history? Kasi lahat naman po tayo ay part ng kasaysayan. Pero since history is a male-dominated concept, yun yung isang reason kung bakit yung word na history ay tinawag na history. So, another example of this is the word chairman and chairwoman. And so, this is quite gender biased. Sa paglalaki, yung nakaupo, tawag sa kanya chairman. Kapag babae, chairwoman. Bakit hindi na lang natin siya tawaging chairperson to make it general and hindi siya biased. And then the next one is the fireman or firemen. Question, puro lalaki lang ba ang firefighters natin? So instead of calling them fireman or firemen, we call them firefighters or firefighter kapag singular. And so those are examples of feminism. Ayan. So for example, in a text wherein wala namang character na babae, so we may also question that part. Bakit walang babae or kababaihan dun sa text? Asan ang kababaihan during that event or during that situation? So, ganun. Paano tinitreat yung kababaihan sa isang text? Ganun yung mga questions na pwede nating erase under feminism. So, again, in feminism, we are uplifting the image of women in our society. Inaalis na natin sila dun sa dati nilang box or sa dati nilang cage na pag sinabing
ganito lang yung kaya nilang gawin which is unfair for them. So in feminism, babaguhin na natin yung image and papalabasin na natin sila dun sa tinatawag nating stereotyping or box. And so those are the literary approaches that you may use in analyzing a specific literary piece. Ayan. So, I will let you answer the activity provided on our Moodle class, and I want you to use these approaches in interpreting those um, stories and the story and the poem which are included on your activity. Yeah, so that's all for this lesson. Thank you and stay safe.